Ashley is just confirming that everything's good. So she's wonderful. Oh, I can't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I was just saying that's good. She should be joining us, but I know
Okay.
she was on the way to a work event, so she might be a little late.
So let me just close things up because as I get older, I stop closing windows. That's never good. Okay.
Okay, I'll share the screen first and get started while people are joining in.
Sure.
For those of you who are new with us, welcome to GOWME's Wilderness Medicine Education Lecture Series. Our mission is to create an educational platform for interested students and healthcare professionals to explore and interact with wilderness and emergency medicine. We like to showcase the diverse spheres in which physicians and other healthcare professionals can make an impact and inspire others to think abstractly about the ways in which we can utilize our careers in healthcare and medicine. We also strive to create an international community of wilderness medicine enthusiasts and experts committed to promoting a diverse and culturally competent environment. We have a QR code here with our mailing list to see everything that we have to offer. We offer these bi-weekly lectures, other opportunities, a yearly fellowship showcase, and some other fun events. I will also include a link in the chat if anyone wants to join later. We have an Instagram and YouTube where you can watch all of our prior lectures and share the recordings. This is our GOWME Board of the Year. And I will introduce Dr. Ruben Salinas. He is a seasoned entrepreneur, investor, and government advisor in the field of medical technology. With over 20 years of experience, he has led innovations in designing, developing, and commercializing advanced medical devices and disruptive technologies, spanning areas such as patient monitoring, critical care, breast biopsy, high-risk pregnancy, infectious diseases, neuromodulation, and ophthalmology. In addition to his professional pursuits, Dr. Salinas is an avid high-altitude mountaineer, certified PADI dive master, private pilot, and nationally certified EMT. An explorer and adventurer at heart, he is passionate about merging his love for exploration with his expertise in emerging technologies, especially as they impact the human experience. After completing a Bachelor's of Science in Industrial and Systems Engineering, he later earned a PhD in Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. This is our schedule for the semester. We do have 2 lectures coming up in November 20th, Get Rule with Dr. Ashley Weissman, and in December, Dr. Matt Friedman is giving a lecture on medical care at Burning Man. With that, I will stop sharing the screen and turn it over.
I think I'd rather be in the Burning Man one.
You'll have to join the next lecture.
All right. Let me share my screen here. Please let me know that you can see full screen.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Just do a little bit of triage here. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I'd love to make this as conversational as possible, not just a talking head over here. Please call me Ruben, and I am not a medical doctor. I am a psych PhD with a background in cognitive neuroscience, an EMT, and an engineer by training. So I like to describe myself mostly as a biomedical engineer at heart. First, a quick disclaimer as per the letter of the law. I want to just reiterate that this presentation is intended for educational purposes only, based on my academic background, research, and practical experience in emergency medicine. Any psychological insights that I share today are general in nature and not intended as clinical or therapeutic advice. And if you're somebody you know is experiencing mental health crisis, please seek help from a licensed mental health professional, of which, as I've described, I am not. With that out of the way, why don't we keep moving forward? This year, I had the privilege of summiting Mount Everest after about 2 years of preparation. And in this experience, I found myself in a dual role. And this dual role basically shared my identity as an adventurer, an explorer, and also as an observer of things that I was particularly drawn to or interested in beyond the obvious of preparing for making a summit bid at Mount Everest. There's a lot of downtime as you're waiting to acclimatize. And so I decided that it was an important piece of the puzzle for me to document my thoughts, reflections, and otherwise observations, especially as they're related to my interests. And so because I'm an active duty volunteer EMT, I figured, let's look at the medical side of things as much as the psychological ones, since both of those are quite interesting to me. And what I decided to do is make observations that might serve others, not knowing that I was going to be invited to such a presentation today. So I think it's important to share personal learnings as much as it is to recite what the clinical literature and clinical studies find, and just personal observations in areas of interest, hobbies in particular, but other areas of human experience and endeavor, such as mountaineering. It is important to figure out where the Venn diagram, the intersections meet, and what novel observations might be made that could serve others. So I invite you all to, as you're building your medical education out, or as you are practicing in the medical field and spending time outdoors, it sounds like this is the perfect group to see the intersection of both sides of that Venn diagram. You consider how those two things meet and how the observations that you have may make a difference, and find ways to share them. In this case, I was very interested in the high altitude expedition impact on both triage and treatment of common medical conditions, things that happen frequently, but also when things get a little bit rougher, and what kind of decision-making input you might consider beyond the obvious physical triage that most of us in emergency medicine are trained in, to include the psychological elements, and understanding when you're going to make go, no go decisions for extrication, for evacuation, when higher acuity care is maybe hours, maybe a few minutes, sometimes days away. So the context in high altitude, I start with this image that you see to the left, which if you really zoom in, you'll see that there's a couple people on ropes there, and that's my Sherpa and me coming to the top of Mount Lobuche. And Lobuche is a peak that's considered an acclimatization and training ground that's preferred by some companies that take people to Mount Everest to summit, because it is much safer than doing a rotation through the Khumbu Icefall, which I'll talk about a little bit. And it also helps me introduce the context within which I'm putting you today during this presentation, and that is in this high altitude environment. So what you see behind us there is the chain of the Himalayas, many beautiful mountains. Amadablam in particular is one that makes its beautiful entry into that picture. And this to highlight that at high altitudes, the combination of harsh environmental stressors may significantly, and typically do, impact a climber's psychology, especially when these are extended expeditions. So things like altitude sickness, oxygen deprivation, hypoxia, intense feelings of cold, physical cold, don't just affect the body. They amplify psychological stressors as well, and hence have an impact to the mind of the person that is experiencing them. And so as such, it's important that when one is involved in high altitude expeditions, that you remember that psychology changes in these extreme environments, and you are going to butt up against people's physical and mental limits, not just the physical. So understanding and managing these psychological dynamics is very crucial, very important for both individual success as well as the success of the team, and for delivering better care ultimately in the case of those that are tasked with doing this type of care. I didn't mention this in the beginning. I apologize. I should have made a little bit more of a note that I will have a couple of images, not too many, that are pretty potentially disturbing, I would say. This is one of them. At first face value, might not seem like that, but that is an actual body. That is a Romanian climber who perished at Camp 3 the same night I was at Camp 3 on my summit bid. He had been on the mountain for 2 months as he was planning to scale Lhotse without supplemental oxygen. And he had completed his acclimatization and rotations in preparation for his summit push, but unfortunately passed away the evening that we were at Camp 3. Now, I didn't know him, for the record, but what's important to highlight here is that this is a reality, right? So if you don't think you're going to be psychologically stressed by just the environment, what you see might actually end up stressing you a lot. In this case, I had the misfortune of seeing this individual, their body, as I was getting ready to depart from Camp 3, and it made an impression on me. And it made a much deeper impression on others and affected them as they were going up. A lot of people turned around because of it. So it's quite an interesting set of dynamics, but the point is that there's a lot of known high altitude killers. We typically talk about these in high altitude medicine, and that includes the very well known and characterized acute mountain sickness, or AMS, high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, and high altitude cerebral edema, or HACE. And these are pretty much well known to both care providers as well as climbers. For sure, guides and Sherpas are extremely aware of signs and symptoms to look for. But what is really important here is to establish that it affects the baseline level of psychological discomfort and anxiety of all climbers, to just know that they are subject to potentially experiencing one of these high altitude killers. And it can just range from a little bit of fear or discomfort, psychologically speaking, all the way through a frustration and constant fear as climbers worry about their physical limitations and consider their risks, especially as they become more and more real while spending time on the mountain. So just knowing that conditions like HAPE and HACE are life-threatening adds a layer of existential anxiety, which leads some climbers to feel a sense of vulnerability and helplessness. Now, not for everybody, but it is something to be mindful of as clinicians. And so as we get deeper into the psychology of extended expeditions, I do want to share that I'm very proud of myself for generating that image with ChatGPT. It's a horrible image because it makes absolutely no sense, but it does describe, at least metaphorically, the long time that one takes in these extended expeditions to just acclimatize and get ready. Expeditions such as climbing Mount Everest or Lhotse Peak, or any other 8,000 meter or even 7,000 meter high altitude peak, lead to significant psychological strain because it's just take a long time. And so things that start to weigh in people's minds here, and I'm talking about otherwise healthy climbers, is the impact of isolation and even cognitive decline that's associated with prolonged isolation and hypoxia. So this is inherent. This isolation that I'm describing is inherent in long duration expeditions and can sometimes be compounded by physical exhaustion, as well as the hypoxia that I mentioned. That lack of oxygen complicates a lot of different things, not just physiological processes. And there's a cognitive decline that occurs and impairs judgment ultimately, that, again, we just as observers, as guides, as climbers, and as care providers need to be ultimately very keenly aware of, right? The witness is not 100% reliable, so to speak, nor is one 100% reliable in self-evaluating and self-diagnosing. So it's really important to consider to consider having somebody watching over you, right? Not constantly, but just the team element here is supremely interesting and important because it's a double and sometimes triple check to make sure things are going in the right direction. When they're not, however, these effects are complicating the management of trauma, things like respiratory distress that is very common at high altitude, and even the less likelihood of people reporting otherwise fairly baseline symptoms, or accurately describing the severity of their condition. There's delirium, there's confusion, there's poor decision-making, which is well documented in cases of prolonged hypoxia. And this all requires not only medical staff, but again, team members, guides, Sherpas, and everybody involved to be on the lookout for physical symptoms and otherwise signs of disorientation or distress. So most folks have heard of climbing Mount Everest and the different camps that it takes. To summit Mount Everest is about a 4 to 5 day endeavor to go up, and then a day or two to come back down to base camp. But the time to get to base camp is usually not considered. And this is a time that's, depending on how you get to base camp, most people trek up there. And that trek takes a number of days, usually anywhere between, depending on where you start, 9 to 13 days, is through a progressive acclimatization to higher and higher altitude, starting at a small airport that you typically arrive from Kathmandu onto through a helicopter or a plane. But this trek involves a significant risk, and that risk is being subjected to a lot of dust and a lot of bugs on the way up from other trekkers and climbers. So respiratory infection risk, and GI infection risk is mounting day after day after day, and you're going higher and higher and higher. So a very important lesson learned is that you're never going to get better going higher. If you are sick, you need to stop and you need to backtrack, because coming down, just like for Haze and Have, is the only real antidote. So I'll share some personal experiences and lessons of my own GI distress that I experienced as I was making my first summit bid during this expedition. I've only done one expedition, so I was successful in the first one. We'll talk about some of the dynamics there as well. But the point is that this is long duration. It involves a significant amount of time, and a lot can happen in that time. And there are ways to manage risks. So one thing that personally I decided to do was avoid the trek altogether. So I pre-acclimatized using a novel technique, using a piece of equipment that lowers your sleeping area's oxygen saturation levels and allows you to arrive pre-acclimatized, and also decided to do a lot of acclimatization trips immediately preceding my departure to Nepal. So what that allowed me to do is bypass a good number of days on trek, within which I would have been exposed to more than likely a lot more bugs, right? So not everybody can spend as much time as it requires. That's one way to minimize the number of days that one's expending. But ultimately, it's still going to take some time to acclimatize to more than 5,000 meters, at which you're going to find yourself at base camp. And you start coughing no matter what. You're more than likely going to be coughing, and that this could be exacerbated by the presence of dust and dung in the air, leading to something called the Khumbu cough. It's very common, and pretty much wherever you showed up within the trek and tea houses, you're going to hear people coughing their lungs out. And that is because of this famous Khumbu cough. But let's get back to the psychological aspects of things. So what are some of the challenges that high altitude climbers face? Well, I've already talked over and over again about hypoxia. That is the sort of root of most evils here, and impact on cognitive function. Hypoxia affects cognitive function in high altitude climbers and leads to impaired decision-making, slowed reaction times, and mood alterations. And this is because oxygen deprivation impacts cognitive abilities and psychological states, making mountaineers vulnerable to confusion and poor judgment. So it's important to be aware again, and I'm going to keep repeating this, awareness of these things is not enough, but it is important for everybody involved in the expedition, so that one's aware about how much more prone to risky decisions at high altitude climbing team members are, all of them, all of us. So there are also certain personality traits that exhibit ways or have exhibited more tolerance to these psychological challenges. And those are typically associated with people that are very resilient, that are tolerant to stress, and that are very effective at managing their own fear response. Now, all of these things can be learned, and that's the beauty of it. None of it is something that you're just going to have to see how you react. You can practice proactively, individually, as a climber, to prepare yourself, to prepare your mindset. And there isn't a better experience than actually being on the mountain. It doesn't have to be in Nepal, doesn't have to be on Everest, but understanding your environment and understanding how your body reacts to high altitude before you're at prime time, trying to make a summit bit on the highest mountain in the world, probably a good idea. We'll see why in a minute. So I've mentioned that isolation and loneliness play a role, are an important factor to consider. And each one of these things that I've mentioned, one can come up with and find very quickly coping mechanisms. So one can read about them, practice them, and there is no substitute, however, for arriving with a good, solid baseline level of mental health and well-being. So it is important to assess yourself as much as it is to be mindful of where is everybody at the baseline level in terms of their mental health, and am I observing, if I see something different than what I observed in Kathmandu with my team, for example, changes to that baseline level of well-being. There are personality traits that are exacerbated when you are on the mountain, so to speak, and in reality, literally on the mountain. And so you want to make sure that you understand the baseline before you call, is this typical or common behavior in this individual, or am I observing something different? One very interesting thing that happened, and I'm going to share a couple of images, but the story is fairly simple, is we had an individual who had communication differences in their learning style, and they were quiet until a little too late. And that affected their sensory processing, and those communication differences had an impact on their injuries, their cold-related injuries, which I'll describe in a minute, because we got to them a little later than we could have had that person been observed a little bit more closely. And the signs were all there for us to understand, okay, this is a very quiet person. They're a little bit detached. There's clearly a difference in communication style, and it's not just personality. There might be other things going on, but the instant red alert should have been for all of us to be a little bit more mindful of paying attention when the rubber was meeting the road and we were at the higher levels of altitude, when things like frost nip and frostbite start to set in. And the cues, the pain cues, need to be very clearly communicated. So in general, and lastly, the longitudinal psychological health, as I've mentioned, is really important. It's interesting, at least to me, that a lot of folks that are regularly engaged in high risk, high altitude, mountaineering being an example of a high risk activity, are exposed to probably more chronic levels of stress, even if they're not outwardly reacting to it or exposing that those chronic levels of stress are having an impact. They do have, in some instances, post-expedition depression. So once people have summited, their mindset shifts. And even when they're not yet off mountain, there are things to be mindful of, and especially those that are more thrill-seeking and up for the challenge, but what might not be considering that once they've reached it, there's a gap there, and there's going to be an impact to their psychological makeup when they come back down, and keeping an eye on them to make sure they come back down safely, because coming down is where things go wrong, more than likely. It's important to keep that in the back of our minds as well. So existential goals and self-identity, really important to start understanding. So dialogue, active dialogue within the team that one finds themselves in. Nobody climbs this by themselves, very few. I shouldn't say nobody, but it is important to get to the sort of essence of somebody that we're spending time with, to understand not only their motivations, but what are their goals here, and are they effectively just adrenaline junkies, or is there a bigger picture thing that we should be aware of, right? And just keep it in mind as you're evaluating people's behavior. Now, something interesting that I learned as I was doing my research and preparing for putting this bucket item list out of the way, so to speak, before I turned 50. I turned 50 last month, and I wanted to do this before I did, is that more and more people are climbing Mount Everest than ever, and they're getting older. And what's interesting is the summit success rates have gone quite high, while the death rates have stayed relatively flat, 1 to 2%. You see the data there from the 1950s when the first documented ascent of Mount Everest and summiting occurred, all the way through, in this case, to 2018 in a study that is referenced here and in our list of references. So, technology has gotten better, guiding has gotten more professionalized, equipment has gotten incredibly superior in terms of its ability to protect the body, keep people safe. And what's interesting is that along with these improvements in technology and increasing overall summit percentages of success rising, there's also a rising age of climbers. And what's important about this is that the older you are, the likelier you're not to succeed in the climb, in summiting. So there's a definite difference between younger folks and their ability to reach the summit and older folks. And by definition, if you're older, you're going to be subject to other physiological things to consider beyond what a normal, very young and let's say physically resilient person might be. So in combination, a lot of interesting variables that have changed over time, some for the good, some not necessarily for the good. So as you see here, chances of success of summit in this paper, which I've referenced again in the back of the slide deck, you will note that drops precipitously after 40. Hence, I was in a rush, right, to try to get this done before I was 50. So I think what's important when it relates to the psychology here is, if you're like me in any way, you're going to be thinking about, well, how do I maximize my shot, my chances of success? And the older you are, naturally, the data suggests you're less likely to succeed. So you got to stack the odds in your favor. Now, when you have an engineering mindset, for example, such as me, you want to understand the root causes. What causes ultimately people to fail? And there are things that are in the minority that are under our control, and there are a lot of things some would consider, depending on what numbers you look at, in the majority that are not in your control. But the one thing is, if you're not preparing adequately, you're more than likely going to suffer. So a baseline understanding of where everybody's fitness level and experience level is, and this is my purpose of including this slide, is really important at the physical level, but also at the psychological level. People that have had experiences, as denoted in this paper, at high altitude fare much, much better than those that have not. So experience does matter. It matters a lot. But too much experience, e.g., being a little too old, doesn't necessarily help you that much. So it is very, very important to balance those two things out and do this at the right time. So being mindful of the older folks in the expedition, important thing to consider, and being mindful of the less experienced folks, irrespective of their age, important thing to consider, as well as their psychological makeup. Why are they there? What's their philosophy beyond what they're telling you at the surface level? You're spending enough time during rotations and at base camp, might as well use it to understand where everybody's coming from and why they're there. So again, especially for those that have a medical background, which I understand all of you, or at least most of you, have or are interested in pursuing careers in healthcare, and wilderness medicine in particular being the topic for this group, really important to consider the full picture, right? It's not just the physical, it's also the psychological that one needs to consider. Okay, so as I've mentioned, high altitude physiology changes have an impact on medical triage. These pictures are not gratuitous. I like them. But on the left there, you see me training around base camp in the ice fall, in the, let's call it, safer training area of the base camp. And you see, maybe if you pay attention, I was probably about 10 pounds heavier on the left than I was on the picture on the right. And that was because I suffered a pretty severe bout of what they termed at the base camp ER traveler's diarrhea. It was really bad. And I was on a plan, on a very rigid nutrition plan, on a very rigid hydration plan, because I realized that those two things are important things to keep one in complete self-care and maximize chances of success. But the tiniest little gastrointestinal distress can exacerbate conditions. Thankfully, I didn't arrive with any baseline conditions, but things like ulcers, gastritis, IBS, things that are underlying conditions that are well managed for a normal person at normal altitude aren't going to flare up, but at altitude they might. And they also may be creating psychological breakdowns in the person's ability to maintain their appetite, respond to nausea, and or maintain proper hydration practices. So all of these things really important to understand that the moment you see very, very basic symptoms of sickness or GI upset, that's the moment when one has to start intervening. Later is too late. And to illustrate this point further, I was part of a Western guided team. I had completed my rotations. Everything was looking very, very nice. The moment that my team made its summit bid, I couldn't keep up with the team. And I started to fall further and further back behind. One of the guides noticed, came back and said, "What's happening?" And I said, "I have no idea. I have no energy left in my legs. I'm sweating very profusely. It's like we had just started an hour and a half. I was about a third of the way through the Kumbu Icefall." And he said, "Okay, I'm going to keep my eyes on you. You're about 50% slower than you were in the last rotation. So something's definitely up." And so he stayed with me. We went up, and within 15 minutes, I called it. I effectively said, "Listen, this is not going to work. I'm not going to get any better going up. And I really want to make sure that I have the best chance of success here. So I'm going to turn around and try it again later when I'm better." And did that, returned to base camp with him and went to base camp ER. Thankfully, I knew everybody because I had visited before to have these conversations, and very easy to diagnose. 24-hour course of antibiotics, rested for about 7 days before the next rotation, the next window opened, and it was a total success. So the reason that I invoke this here is because I had very mild GI upset the day before. Woke up, felt fine, had an appetite, was fully hydrated, took all my electrolytes, but I still wasn't 100%. And it was very, very fast. Clearly, it had taken a lot more out of me than I had myself had anticipated. But I think what's important there, in addition to relaying the story and sort of the symptoms and what happened, as gross as it might be to some of you, is that I recognized that I wasn't going to get any better a lot because I was observing what had happened with others. And also, I didn't want to be in a psychologically compromised position. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't worried about, am I going to make it? Am I going to make it? Is this going to work? I just basically made the call, not knowing whether I was going to get a second shot. It was early enough in the season that I figured I would, but I didn't know for sure. And I just decided that based on my go, no go criteria, it was time to turn around. So the long and the short of it there is important for us to have very clearly set go, no go criteria, and for others in the expedition to be aware of them, right? So they can remind you of them, because as I've already stated, hypoxia does funny things to judgment. Okay, went a little too far there. I mentioned that I made it to Everest Base Camp for the second time, now as a patient, not just an observer, having fun. And here you see part of the Himalayan Rescue Association ER camp team members, Dr. Gregory Stiller, who's an emergency medicine physician, and I believe he was a former Air Force physician as well. Dr. Nishant Joshi, who's a Nepali doctor. He was the one that actually saw me when I came in. This was our social visit. And to the right there, half a face, you see one of my climbing team members. He is a medical student, also former Naval Special Warfare team member. And he's at Texas A&M completing his medical degree now. So we were both very interested in emergency medicine and meeting the team at the ER and understanding how do they do what they do. And importantly, I ended up seeing them as a patient very quickly thereafter. But we also learned that while the Rescue Association ER treats primarily Nepali team members, they are dealing with a lot of these psychological conditions underlying presentation, which they were keenly aware of and described to the T based on their experience. But again, you're not always going to be at Everest Base Camp with a team as well trained as HRAs. You are more than likely going to be in more austere environments. So even the most basic training and medical response and wilderness medical preparation as a woofer, for example, wilderness first responder, comes in handy and can be augmented if you've got these psychological signs and symptoms to be adding to your workup and triage. Now, there's a team member there. Thankfully, his face was already covered. He was one that was a very interesting case. So I won't name names, but I will share that extremely fit individual, a little older, and he was with Pat, the gentleman that's to the right there. There's a medical student and me on the same team. He had an episode of AFib after a pretty, I would say, intense training session in the ice fall, and it was reported by his Apple Watch. Had he not had that Apple Watch go off, I probably honestly wouldn't have noticed all of the signs that were a lot more obvious once he reported that AFib came up and he had to go home. So he had to abandon the expedition. But as Pat and I put our heads together and discussed with members of the HRA, what could have we noticed? There were a lot of things that we considered, but didn't really put two and two together. And, neither of us is a walking ECG, but it is important to note that there were very obvious signs that we missed, right? There's a medical student, an EMT, maybe not a paramedic, but still things that we probably could have brought to others' attention and been a little bit more proactive here. Thankfully, nothing bad happened. It was caught on time other than missing an expedition, but these things matter. Okay, so your input and feedback and awareness matters if you're a part of these teams or medical teams. This is an actual image from one of my other team members, used with permission, of course. And it is, as you can tell, a cold injury. This happened with an individual that had communication differences, right? Sensory processing changes in high altitude. And if somebody is not very verbal, the relaying of a pain experience or discomfort, not yet at the pain level, any form of atypical pain expression is going to be really important to try to elicit through other means, not just, are they reliably answering my questions? Is everything okay? Any pain, fingers and toes good? Can you move, etc. Right? So being very, very proactive probably could have prevented this because we knew there were communication differences here and we needed to be a little bit more aware. We weren't. Thankfully, toes are still on. We didn't lose them, but it definitely impacted the experience of the team. Thankfully, again, everything went well, but could have not. All right, so let me now switch in preparation for Q&A, just sharing with images what this actually looks like, right? Because it is incredibly beautiful. And the imagery is probably the number one thing, experiencing this firsthand, that I was looking to capture, right? With my eyes and with my brain, not necessarily with a camera and or through video, right? Somebody else capturing it for me. And so what you see here on the left is part of that training that I mentioned in the ice fall. When you're at base camp, there are a few things you can be doing. You could be resting, which is highly encouraged. You could be reading, which is also highly encouraged, keeping your mind busy. You could be socializing, very much encouraged. Not always happens, unfortunately. So more and more companies are recognizing the importance of keeping social ties, connections, and good and positive team dynamics to improve the overall psychological well-being of the team, not just the individual. And, one of the things that I really enjoyed about being at base camp was the social interactions, especially when we were, recounting our day on the mountain, so to speak, our day in the ice fall, as we were doing here some rappel practice, and some climbing on fixed ropes, preparing for transitions and things of that nature. So this is what base camp ultimately looks like. For those of you that have never seen it, I would doubt that very many of you have not at least seen some imagery. What you see to the left there is the Khumbu ice fall. So if you notice what turns kind of from, goes from right to left and back to right, kind of snakes through, this is the ice fall right here. And this is ever evolving. It's always moving. And it doesn't look like it here, but there are ice seracs and ice blocks here that are massive. So this is a dynamic environment, the highest risk part of making the climb. It actually is right after base camp. Now, base camp is all of these little tents that you see here. Those tents house a couple thousand people. It's literally a village. And you have a significant number of people, and we all know that the more people that are all coughing and sharing germs leads to things that at high altitude can lead to more pronounced things to consider in triaging somebody that's experiencing what looks like a pretty basic GI upset, because they're definitely not going to get better anytime soon. And respiratory conditions abound, right? I already talked about the Khumbu cough. Now, accommodations vary quite a bit, but typically they're tents, right? People are going to be in a tent, and they're going to be in these tents for an extended period of time. So just think about, a tent's cool for a few days, but for a few weeks, probably starts to get a little old, right? So you want to make sure that you are properly resting, setting yourself up for success, and keeping in mind as a care provider that a lot of the stuff that you might hear about is just plain people have been sleeping on the floor for a while, so they're going to be sore, right? But there might be more to it. And that's, I think, one of the important things to highlight, that not everything is a red alert, but you just need to ask a few more questions than normal and be very wildly observant. Now, I've mentioned the Khumbu ice fall. There's an example to the left of a serac. That serac is about 15 feet tall, maybe a little bit more. I can't remember exactly. But these things are dynamic, and they fall frequently, and they crush people on their path. So it is a very treacherous arena. The Khumbu ice fall is also where the big crevasses and cracks are. You see me there crossing one in one of the famous ladders. Doesn't look like much there, but trust me, when you're looking down into that crevasse, that's pretty intimidating. So I don't know if you can see this video, but there's a lot of fixed line climb. It's a very unstable terrain in this area. So my point in showing you these images is just to highlight why some people start getting in their head about the ice fall. We had in our expedition 2 team members that, after very successful rotations and going through the ice fall faster than most other members of the team, decided to abandon. And they left their summit bids inconclusive because they decided that they didn't want to do the ice fall anymore. So you have to cross through the ice fall to get to Camp 1, obviously. And when you get to Camp 1, you see this incredible valley. That's probably my favorite part of the whole trip. It is where you get to meditate as you walk. And you're also on a fixed line. This is where you get to relax a little bit, say hi to everybody. That's me, by the way. Skipping over a crevasse, a crack. And the reason I put this here is just to highlight the enormity of the terrain around you. It's very overwhelming. And to some, it moves people towards the positive, towards emotions of awe and wonder, for example. But towards the negative, it can make your sense of smallness very, very big. Your sense of self feeling immaterial, leading all the way to nihilism, is actually a really real phenomenon. So this is just another picture to the right here of Camp 1. The temperatures, I cannot describe to you how cold you feel. It is, no matter how well prepared and how good your equipment is, impossible to get your hands and feet warm, even when the sun hasn't completely left the building. So really important to keep that in mind. Now, this is Camp 2. Camp 2 is a good place to do a few things, namely rest and prepare for a big push into Camp 3. And also some individuals on those teams decide to start oxygen here. I think that's a really good idea, right? Less oxygen, more hypoxia, more risk. So the earlier you can start oxygen, the better. Most people carry it from Camp 2 forward and start using it on their transition to Camp 3 or from Camp 3, if at all possible, and you're gonna go into something like this, I would highly recommend doing a oxygen from Camp 2, if at all possible. This is a picture of Camp 3, and I believe I have a quick video here. There is no room to maneuver between these shelves cut into the snow and ice of Camp 3. It is highly uncomfortable. One doesn't really sleep or rest there. The views are magnificent, but it is very uncomfortable. All right, we'll move from here to the next. Finally, South Call or Camp 4. And this is where it starts getting just incredible. The views are fantastic, but here you are beyond the so-called death zone. You're actively dying. The longer you stay here, the worse things look. So this is what you see from Camp 4. The individuals that you see making their trek up here, this is Everest. This is what you don't see from base camp because it's behind another mountain. So it starts taking a while to get to viewing it from this perspective from Camp 4, probably arguably the most beautiful place to look at Everest proper from. You don't want to be here too long. So in the spirit of getting to questions and answers, hopefully there'll be some. Let me describe some of the general lessons learned, not necessarily pursuant to this topic only, but I do want to share a few things that for me were important, right? Getting comfortable with discomfort and considering the worst case scenario was something that I spent a lot of time thinking about and preparing myself for. I knew going in, as I've already mentioned, that mortality is about 1 to 2% per expedition. So for every 100 climbers who attempt to summit, 1 or 2 are probably not going to make it home. So setting that go, no go criteria early is really important. Reinforcing it with your teammates, again, really important. And in my case, I decided that getting my affairs in order before leaving was really important. And I wrote my OSL. I'll let you read what that means. And that was basically directed at my loved ones, so they knew with precision what my last wishes were in the event of a worst case scenario. And I think that the unfortunate reality is that while it doesn't happen very often, it does continue to happen. Dan Patterson here, may he rest in peace, died right in front of me. He was, along with his Sherpa, somebody that was coming down after summiting, and there was a cornice that basically broke off the top of the mountain, and he and his Sherpa were not, for some reason unknown yet, not clipped to the safety line, and they fell into Tibet and never were heard from again. So we control the variables that we can, and preparation is always going to enhance your odds. Finally, sorry about that. Mindset is 100%. Here it says 90, but it is extremely important. Physical preparation does not make up for it. So coping mechanisms and psychological resilience, coming up with mental strategies is keenly important. A lot of studies have shown that climbers develop psychological resilience strategies to cope with the stressors. They include things like mindfulness, goal setting, visualization, social support from team members, and a sense of brotherhood. That all matters. And finally, keep in mind that the mountain is always in charge. You're not. Don't get paranoid, but remain vigilant for yourself and for your team members. I'll stop there and leave it open for questions.
Thank you, Ruben. If anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. I had one question. Just from your experience hearing about other people's expeditions and everything, do you think that guides or anyone like involved professionally in these expeditions, they're well aware of the psychological toll and what to look for, or do you think there's needed education on that side of things?
I think that's a great question. I would say there's an awareness, no doubt. The more experienced the guide, the more experienced the, let's call it the service provider, the more keenly aware they're going to be of telltale signs, right? The reality is most people need to be observed. There's an interview process by all companies. There should be, if there isn't, be mindful of that. And that interview process typically focuses on experience, but in relaying your experience and in being interviewed, one of the things that I knew was being carefully looked at and considered for me, as an example, by the company leader that I used, was just where's this person coming from, right? Why are they interested in doing this? What's their experience base? And are they in the right mindset, right? And everybody has very different reasons. So I think it's who are we or the guides to say, oh, that's a good reason or that's not a good reason for you to climb or attempt to climb Mount Everest. But I do think that there's this underlying experience-based seeking of what are telltale signs that somebody may not be coming in with a good baseline level of mental health, right? And that's one. And then the second is it's ever evolving, meaning it is things just change. There was one team member who unfortunately didn't summit, and he got extremely homesick. And he was asking everybody all sorts of questions from the people that had already gone up and were still coming back to base camp after their summit bid. And at first I was like, that's good. You're asking all these questions. That's seeking the appropriate level of intelligence, right? Of information, of reconnaissance to be as prepared as possible. But what was really happening is that the number of questions was actually increasing as his anxiety was increasing. And when he reached Camp 3, I saw him and he said something to me in the morning, and I turned over to my Sherpa and I said, he's not going to be here this afternoon. And sure enough, I left. And then when I got to Camp 4, I asked and they said, oh, he actually never left Camp 3. He went back down. So he didn't say anything that led me to believe that, but it was just the look in his face. And what was reported to us as a team about his reasons were homesickness. Whether it was really homesickness in and of itself or sort of anxiety growing as the homesickness was hitting, it's a confluence of psychological factors that nobody will ever know because those folks that we are all unreliable witnesses, so to speak, right? Especially males are not very self-aware. So I would say that even if I'll give you an example for the physicians or physicians to be in the group here. The number one question that every male is asked at a physical exam, for which the answer is 99.9% of the time no, is have you been feeling depressed lately? Right? So depression screening is a fail in males. And that is by definition something you can't rely on their verbal, right? You need to make sure you're looking for signs and understanding other symptoms expressed perhaps in different ways, right? In the case of this example that I mentioned, the increasing number of questions was very obviously driving a signal towards the anxiety that was being experienced internally, right? That turmoil. One other thing, I didn't use the term, but altered mental status is a real thing, especially in hypoxia. It gets sometimes muddled because people can be speaking full sentences. You wouldn't necessarily consider them in altered mental status in and of itself, but there are other ways to make sure you can assess it beyond the known clinical ones, right? Than the known clinical questions. And so I think one of the things that you have to kind of have an ear for, as well as eyes on the person over time to understand changes from baseline. And I keep saying baseline because that matters a lot when you have as much time with people as you do in a long-term expedition here. So I think I've been a little long-winded on that question, so hopefully I got you an answer that you were looking for.
Definitely.
Hello, Ruben.
See, Alberto, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for sharing this experience, Ruben. I am so thrilled about the whole experience that you shared, and I simply want to say congrats for your achievement. And I have a couple of questions. First one is, have you noticed something in your mindset changed after you did the expedition? And the second one, if I can advance it, what was the hardest moment of the overall expedition for yourself? Not the team, but for yourself.
Oh, good questions. I think the durable change, Alberto, and you and I know each other. We should report here for the rest of the crew from a long time ago. So 40 years, I think, almost 40 years. And so we're longtime friends. I could tell you that probably the lesson that I took away that most impacted me was, wow, I can put up with a lot of pain. And it's not just physical pain. It is just psychological pain. Like, to me, there are two things in my personality that are really helpful. One is I use humor a lot with myself. I laugh at myself constantly, and with others as a way to sort of socialize more easily. And it is a very, very good tool, but it doesn't solve all the problems. And so sometimes the evidence that I've now come to accumulate with other ways of evaluating, let's call it, for lack of a better term, mental toughness, I am much more surprised. And I'll give you a very specific example, Alberto, where I recently ran the Berlin Marathon at the end of September, and my training was not great because I'm running another company at the time, recently, I should say. And it was the exact same mental game. I've described this to a couple of people of, oh, it's just a little more. It's just a little more. Like, how many miles am I down? Which was like, where am I? Am I close to, at this rhythm, getting close to South Summit? Am I so far away from the balcony? Like, all these games around distance and time that I was just playing with myself in my own mind were just enabling me to maintain awareness away from physical pain, right? It was there. It was always in my awareness, but I was able to kind of, in my mind, distract myself from it. And the level of tolerance and the ability to sustain that was something that surprised me, that I learned there. I think that answers the first one. And what was your second one again, Alberto, just so I get it right?
What was the hardest moment for yourself during the expedition?
Yeah, I think it was undoubtedly, I saw multiple bodies, not from climbers that had been visible for a long time and left there, but I saw the Romanian climber. I saw a couple of bodies that were retrieved from Lhotse through an army retrieval process. And I was also exposed to a Sherpa at Camp 4 that had been just brought down. His body had been brought down, who had been up there for 11 years. And I think what struck me the most of seeing those bodies was I was surprised at my own reaction, which wasn't much of a reaction, I guess is a good way to say it. The hard part for me was realizing how numb I felt. Like, it didn't impact me as much as I thought it was going to impact me. So that was hard. Like, I couldn't understand why. It kind of bothered me and continues to bother me. They're physical bodies, but I was like, man, keep moving. So I don't know why. Kind of an unusual one. Thank you for the question. I saw another one on the chat here. Would it be base camp in April? You want to respect the climbers, not get in the way. Is it possible to check out the Everest ER tent and meet the doctors as someone who's summiting or hopefully not seeking medical care? This is so inspiring. Yes. So please, if you're at base camp, please, please, please visit the ER. They love it. And they are talkers, man. They love to bend people's ear. And when they're busy, please respect that. But when they're not, they are very, very happy to answer questions from, people like me who are an EMT, emergency medical provider, medical students like Pat, who was with me. We spent like 3 hours with them, and people were coming in for minor things, and they would triage them and just keep talking to us and let us observe and assist. And it was really cool. So absolutely, Alexia, I think it is, visit them, right? They're going to be beyond where a trekker would normally go. So you have to walk into base camp and just ask for directions, and they'll let you know with precision where they're going to be, and say, hey, a couple of people that were here and that were climbers sent us here saying you guys were awesome. Is that true? And they'll, I'm sure, make time for you and give you guidance as to how to pursue that as well, as they did with Pat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Greg, I see your hand raised there.
Yeah, are we out of time, or we want to keep dabbling here? I'm happy to pass if we're going to end it, but I do have a question. Okay, I'll just go for it. Hey, so I'm wondering, just as recommendations, I'm going to assume a lot of the folks on this listening in are younger, just starting out in their professional and expedition lives, whatever. So I didn't really hear much about the preparation in terms of even thinking longer term, like years. This is in many ways the pinnacle of climbing expeditions, maybe not technically in certain aspects, but certainly endurance and stuff. So if you just comment for their benefit on maybe a training path of many years in order to take on an Everest expedition.
Great question, Greg. I actually did a presentation on this very topic, so I can tell you how I went about it. I did a lot of research myself starting in summer of 22, having had no formal mountaineering training or experience, and thinking, I want to do this before I'm 50. What is it going to take? Now, again, think about it as an engineer. So I went from a root cause analysis. What happens with those that failed? Like, what are the most common reasons for failure? And the number one thing that was highlighted was, within the variables that you do control, preparation. Okay, well, what does preparation entail? And it's not necessarily clear. ChatGPT is not very helpful. It wasn't as prevalent or even out there as much in the summer of 22, but ChatGPT has actually given me great answers on things that I know to be true because I experienced them. And in summary, it's this, right? I decided to do 3 things. One is physically go there. So I did Everest Base Camp Trek in December of 22. It was a 2-week expedition, and I was really lucky because my guide had just summited Everest that day. He was a local that year. He was a local Nepalese Sherpa. So we went in December of 22. He summited in May of 22. And he was amazing. He basically told me, here's how I went about it. Here was my experience. Here's basically what you should think about. And here are the companies that I, as a Nepali, can tell you I would recommend. And so I went and talked to those companies and said, listen, I don't have a ton of experience, but I am extremely committed. I have time, and tell me what it's going to take. So got a bunch of different answers, but I started to get to a final list of things, which were basically can be summarized in 3. One is, you absolutely want to be at high altitude, at the highest you can accommodate within your schedule, as frequently as possible, because you just don't know if you're a good responder or a bad responder to high altitude. Some people, inevitably, no matter how well trained they are, they're genetically not predisposed to be at high altitude. They just don't function well. And they could be fit as a fiddle. They can be extremely good mountaineers at lower altitudes. But once you cross 6,000 meters, things change. That's number one. So test yourself on a mountain. 2 is prepare physically, meaning make the time to get a training regimen that's specific to mountaineering. So I joined first a training group with a company called Uphill Athlete. And Uphill has programs for mountaineers, and they range in weeks to prepare you for your first, right? But don't do it for Everest being the first, of course. They prepared me for several different mountains that I did before. And in total, I trained for about 18 months, a little less than 18 months. And so within the time that I had wanting to target the spring of 2024, I kind of worked backwards. What are the mountains that I can realistically get done? What training do I need to get them done? And, you know, what are the things that are highly technical that I probably won't need? So that's how I went about it. And it worked, right? So I created a plan working backwards. That's the third thing. I hope that answers your question, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just add though, again, for mostly the youngsters, I would say if, think longer term than that, maybe, and work your way up to it. So maybe, 10-year plan, whatever, and get good experience and, go to Denali, other places, and, you get used to this stuff a little bit more. So that's all. Thanks.
That's right. That's right, Greg. Yep. Yeah, definitely don't show up wanting to climb Everest. That's your very first mountain. Probably not going to go well, even if you're super young.
Yeah.
Preparation does make a difference. Right? Any other questions? Go ahead, Alberto.
What was the happiest moment?
Well, that's easy. Reaching the summit. Yeah, that was by far the happiest moment. My dissertation, my doctoral dissertation was on the emotion of awe and the neurophysiological effects of the emotion of awe. And I knew for a fact that I was going to more than likely experience the emotion when I saw the view from the top. And that was what I was completely enamored with and obsessed with achieving, right? It was just like, let me take in the view when I get up there. And it was everything that I thought it would be and more. So everything that I had hoped for. I would say that there are a couple of images that we took while we were going up. You just cannot do it justice. It is just the most majestic view on the one hand. On the other, there is this incredible camaraderie with climbers as you're coming up and down. It's crowded. It's getting more crowded. And so on some level, it's really annoying that you have to be in line, basically going up this steep hill on a rope in very uncomfortable conditions. But in the end, it's worth it. And the camaraderie and people helping each other, going up, coming down, it's unspoken. Every language that you ever imagined is being spoken on the mountain, but you can communicate irrespective of whether you speak the same language or not. There is this shared bond of being on the mountain together. And there's not a single time that I observed anybody not extending a helping hand. All right, so maybe we leave it here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ruben, for the great lecture. I'm sure everyone who wasn't able to make it tonight will love to tune in on YouTube after the fact. And thank you everyone for joining us. If there's any questions, you can hang out, but thank y'all.
All right, thanks a ton for the invitation. Talk to you all soon.